Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Giuliana Spadaro. She is postdoctoral researcher in the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands. She is interested in conducting experimental research on prosocial and cooperative behavior. Her PhD project captured this interest and focused on understanding the relation between institutions, trust, and cooperation among strangers, and that's the topics that we're going to talk about today. So, Juliana, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you today, and thanks for the nice introduction, Ricardo.
Yeah, of course. So, let's start with this. What is trust from a social, psychological perspective?
Well, it's nice that you are already specifying and asking for a definition from the social psychological perspective, because when I start working on trust, I was really surprised to see that there is nothing like a definition of this concept, and every discipline approach it from different ways. But what I was able to get across all the different disciplines and all the different definition is that trust seems to have some core elements, and pretty much everyone agrees on that right now. And so we can say that having trust in another person means that we place ourselves in a position of vulnerability. So we are exposed to a risk, and we decide to take this risk nevertheless because we believe that the other person is going to act in a benevolent way and is not going to exploit this trust. So if you keep this definition in mind, you start realizing, as I did, that actually like almost every interaction that we have in our social environment is related to trust, and we're asked to make trust calls and trust judgment more frequently than what we expect.
hmm But this trust, I mean, probably it works differently when it comes to family and friends and close people and strangers, right?
Yeah, that's completely true. And in fact, if we deal and try to understand what happens around trusting strangers and what drives the choices here, it's another different story, because with strangers we have no background information, or usually we have little to none information that can help us to create this assessment of the other person benevolence. While, of course, in close relationships with family, friends, it's another story. We have a lot of information, and we can constantly update our trust judgment, or also according to a history of relationship we have with them. While with trusted strangers is basically most of the time only one shot, one interaction with little information. So it's true that
hmm
becomes tricky.
Right. And what are sort of the factors that positively contribute to trust, particularly among strangers?
Okay, that's a good question, and actually, all the research is focused on trying to understand what indeed contributes to developing trust towards strangers. So one type of approach focus on some dispositional factors. So there is a common agreement on the fact that some people just are born with a higher disposition to trust others, and this kind of trait, this kind of disposition, is pretty stable and is something that is always there, like in all the interactions. And and also, like according to this perspective, there is also some evidence in favor that there is something even genetic about trust. And trust is a trait, and it's something that can be inherited in generations by generations. There is also another type of approach, and is resemble more what I've been interested in understanding. There is more focusing on the role of experience in shaping trust. And it's based on the idea that we are, as I was mentioning before, we have a lot of interactions that involve the decisions to trust others, like in our daily life. And the idea here is that the outcome of these interactions really affect the likelihood we're going to trust people again in the future. So, for example, if we are constantly betrayed, and if our trust is placed in the wrong hands many times after the others, we might expect to generalize this kind of negative expectations also to other situations, even in which we don't know the people, and even different situations too.
Mhm. But those sort of more, let's say, social or developmental factors, I mean, is it that when people are exposed to a particular social environment while they are growing up, that then they develop some sort of way of dealing with others?
Yes, that's completely true, and there is a lot of evidence coming also from developmental psychology to social psychology and other branches of psychology. And indeed, what happens in the early process of socialization, so interactions with caregivers, for example, as predicted by attachment theory, is very important in shaping a sort of worldview, like a sort of a perception of the surrounding world, like a place in which people are going to be helpful, are going to be trustworthy, and a sort of vision of the world, like a place in which I can I can place myself in that position of vulnerability because nothing too bad is going to happen. And yeah, this change individually, and this is very much related to in early interactions and experience.
Mhm. But are these reactions that people have to others fixed after a certain point in their lives? Or is it the case that if they change their social environment, they might get more or less trusty of others?
So this is not a deterministic approach. So it doesn't mean that what happens in this kind of early interaction is going to affect your social outcomes for the entire life, because it has been shown that especially with trust, trust can change according to what happened in the social environment, even at later stage of life. So uh, if we want to stick to the attachment perspective, what we see is that, for example, interactions later on with other significant others, for example, a romantic partner or like very close friends, can really change the attachment style. So the way in which we see others also as trustworthy and so on and so forth. But also, if we think about trust from like a societal perspective, there are some studies on migration that show that when people migrate from, for example, low trusting countries, like Italy can be, and migrate to Northern European countries that are usually in which people are usually more trustful and more trustworthy, those people change and adapt their level of trust. And if we then measure the level of trust of these migrants with comparable others that remained in their country of origin, we see that there are some striking differences that are accountable mainly for this change in the social environment.
Mhm. And how do levels of trust emerge on a societal level? I mean, do we have to start by looking at how individuals interact with one another, or can we look directly at some social forces, let's say?
Yeah, indeed. What I've been talking about was pretty much based on the individual level. So we said like what drives this perception and what drives this judgment, but we can also see trust from the societal level. And this is, for example, the focus of the work from the political science and from sociology that takes all a different angle. And what we notice if we look at this is that there are some societies that overall can be perceived as more trustful than others. So, and all this research is based on, for example, very popular large-scale surveys that include some items that measure the perception of general others as trustworthy, as a and Yeah, so based on this kind of research, we had the idea that some societies are more trustful than others.
Mhm. And do you know, for example, why is it that when we compare countries, some of them have higher levels of trust and others lower? Like, for example, South Europe usually has lower levels of trust than North Europe. Do we know anything about that?
Yes, that's indeed it was very interesting to see this difference, and what like one of the most prominent explanations of that is focusing on the role of institutions. So because like those societies and those countries all rely on different institutions that differ for quality and produce different societal outcomes as well. So if institutions work well in a country, we can expect a set of other consequences. And also, some research show that indeed there is a strong correlation between, for example, the the degree to which people perceive that a government in a society is corrupt, and also the trust that they pose in others, or for example, the some more objective indicators like the rule of law. So how much the norms are followed and enforced in a certain society is also correlated to how much individuals trust each other.
But I mean, this is the result of the kinds of institutions that we have set in place. But do we know why different institutions develop in different places?
So this is all of a different debate, because of course these institutions evolve and are exactly like this because there were like different histories that the societies faced in the past. But what's common among these institutions is like the main function, also from an evolutionary point of view, because institutions are in place, were put in place in the very first place to provide some structures and some norms, and so that they would allow individuals to create expectations in the social interaction, even in social interaction that were more uncertain, like for example those with strangers.
Right. Um, is interpersonal trust associated with, or on a societal level, in this case, with social, economic, and political outcomes, for example?
Yes, we can see some constant patterns there. So, for example, we see that in societies in which there is a high interpersonal trust towards strangers, we can see some other societal benefits. For example, a higher contribution to charity donations, or more volunteering, or in general, in these societies, individuals report to be happier and have a higher level of well-being. So here, the definition as trust that is always made in sociology as a social lubricant is really appropriate because we see that the entire social interaction become like are facilitated by the degree of trust. And also from the economic point of view, trust is associated to a different of outcomes based on the idea that in interaction in which there is trust, the transaction costs are reduced. So we don't need like very complex structures to accommodate that economic interaction because there is trust in place. And indeed, we can see that there is like more economic growth over time and more behavior, for example, tax compliance that all contribute to economic wealth of societies.
So there's a relationship between trust and cooperation, right?
Yes, I think at this stage it becomes pretty evident from what I mentioned. But if we think about what is cooperation, it becomes like immediately even more evident. So when individuals are required to cooperate and are faced with this kind of decision, they face a dilemma. And they are facing a conflict of interest between getting like an individual positive outcome in the short term, something good for the self, or making a decision that benefits the entire collective but pose a cost to the self. what's interesting here is that deciding to contribute to the collective it becomes costly for the individuals, especially if other people are deciding to keep the to prioritize themselves and to free ride. So there is a high risk of exploitations there. And there, like if you have like a high degree of trust, you have strong expectations that others will be benevolent, will contribute, and this will lead to greater cooperation in turn.
Something interesting came to my mind now. That is, so for example, one way of studying different societies is by comparing their levels of individualism and collectivism. So
Yeah.
there's sort of an individualist collectivist spectrum. Does that have anything to do with trust and cooperation? Because in that case, perhaps would we expect that collectivist societies would have higher levels of interpersonal trust?
All right. I'm very glad that you asked me this question. This gives me the opportunity to share like the results of some work I'm conducting right now. So we are running together with Dan Balliet, Caroline Graff, and other colleagues a big meta-analysis. So that's a meta-analysis on like 1,500 studies across 70 countries, and it tries to account for the cross-cultural variation that we find in cooperative behavior. So what we did here was to select some prominent theories, and individualism and collectivism and the role of values is one of those, and trying to see whether it explains variation in cooperation. So we can do like two hypotheses from that. One that is more in line to what you were mentioning, and the other one that is actually an opposite prediction. So especially early approach on the topic would predict that we would expect more cooperation in collectivistic societies, because collectivistic societies are thought to value the collective outcome more than the self. So there is really a collective thought in there. But also, on the other hand, more recent approach show that in collectivistic societies, the interaction is based in very tight groups and tight networks. So we could expect more trust and more cooperation within those networks, but more skepticism when interacting with strangers, because individuals were not used to. That's not what they did over time. So we test both of these predictions in our meta-analysis, and we found no evidence of a relationship between collectivism, individualism, and cooperation. So I'm sorry, I must say that at least in our data, it doesn't play much of a role.
That's interesting. So would that indicate, as you mentioned, I guess, that in collectivistic societies, what we get in terms of cooperation runs mostly I mean, in closely related groups, people that are part of the same social group and things like that?
Yes, that's exactly the hypothesis, and also like some other work that is similar or makes a similar prediction also provide evidence for this idea. Also, like the work from Joe Henrik and that group really show that in societies that had some institutions, so for example those, so like here the church played a very important role historically in societies in which we could expect the relationships all revolving within tight-knit groups. We can't expect much more of a cooperation towards strangers in there. And this happens, yeah, and there are like several factors that can influence why people, whether people were interacting in these sort of small communities or had more of a global mindset and were open to other kind of relationships.
And what would be those factors, by the way? Do we know anything about that?
What do you mean?
The factors that you say play a role in promoting cooperation, mostly in tight-knit groups instead
So
of.
even like the quality of institutions would play a role, because if we, for example, Let's think about situations in which individuals were facing some threats or some risks in the past, even like from a stress, like pathogen stress, or some threats that were posed by some environmental factors, or some threats that were posed by some like interpersonal factors, like war or conflicts. So if we have some institutions that are not working well, we would expect individuals to rely more on their community and very small networks also there. But if also, in the other hand, the institution can provide for the need of the society, individuals feel also more secure to explore other forms of interaction and don't need the support that they can get from institutions, from the very small communities.
So in this case, in societies where cooperation occurs mostly in tight-knit groups, we would expect probably to have higher levels of nepotism, for example.
Yeah, like if we consider that as an indicator of quality of institutions, I would expect so. And that's also like what is proposed, not about nepotism per se, by the material security hypothesis. So it's really a set of theories that all converge to this eventual idea.
Right. And how do we get strangers to cooperate then?
Okay, that's the key question, and that's what like every researcher dealing with cooperation is trying to understand. There are like different features of the situation we can intervene to make people more cooperative, and I can try to mention a few. I'm gonna do that right now, but I'd like to share another thing. So with our research that might be relevant to this question, with our research group, we develop the so-called cooperation data bank. So we basically selected all empirical studies on cooperation and annotated some variables that describe the structure of the study, how much cooperation was in place, and what are the variables that were studied and placed in relationship with cooperation. So whoever is interested in understanding which are the factors that most strongly are associated with cooperation, even like doing their own meta-analysis, they can now do that just going to this platform and playing around with that. So you can really see and compare the effect sizes of different variables in relationship to cooperation. But so as to your question of which factors can promote cooperation in interaction with strangers, a set of possible interventions we can make deal with making possible to rely on reputational information. I know we're talking about strangers, but for example, in some contexts, like in sharing economy, when people have to buy or sell in an online context that they don't know each other, it's very important and very effective to establish some kind of systems that can keep track of a person's reputation, so past behavior in a relevant setting. And it also makes the behavior more accountable and reduce anonymity, and this also can increase cooperation in this setting. And another possibility is, and to be honest, is one of the strongest effect again, is to implement and to establish institutions in place. So besides what we mentioned before on the societal level, is also what we see consistently in experiments.
Right. And in terms of migration, this just came to my mind. Can we understand better why certain groups of migrants adapt to their local, to their new culture or not, in terms of their levels of interpersonal trust?
Yeah, these migration studies are very interesting. Like it's like a very privileged quasi-experiment setting to answer this question, and um, they they provide different opportunities. So we can compare the levels of trust of the people who leave a country and how these levels of trust adapt to the social conditions and to the institutional factors. But also we can also test within the same countries to what extent trust persists across generations. So we can like even compare like immigrants of second or third generation. We can compare their trust levels with the trust level of their parents and grandparents. And what these studies show is that indeed trust change. So this is not something that is very stable. Otherwise, we would not find these very strong effects.
But do they tend to adapt to the levels of interpersonal trust they find in their new society, the society they migrated to, or
Exactly.
not?
That's what it happens. That so for example, migrating to a Northern European country will boost the level of social trust.
Right. Earlier, you mentioned at a certain point that there were people that studied individual differences in prosocial behavior. Do you also do that? And do we know perhaps what are some of the personality traits associated with prosocial behavior?
Yeah, I can tell a bit about that. So because we together with Isa Tillman and Dan Balliet, we conduct a meta-analysis trying to address this question very specifically. So as you were mentioning, what we observed across a set. Across thousands of studies and consistent across situation is that some individuals just um, for example, behave in a cooperative way across a broad set of situations. And this kind of cooperative way to interact is stable also across time. So this really is convincing evidence that there is some individual difference related to prosociality, and also because sometimes most of these behaviors really go against what we would predict from according to classic economic theory. So in this situation, it would even seem irrational to cooperate, but people do that nevertheless. So what we did in our work was to meta-analyze all these experiments that employed economic games, because they were like very standardized settings in which we could observe emerging these prosocial and cooperative behavior. And what we did was trying to select a set of different studies, because many different paradigms provide different features of the situation. So there is nothing like an economic game. We're talking about very different things. And what we observed is that there is no trait that result in enhance, for example, cooperation across all these situations. But the situation matters a lot. And so, for example, what we propose with our theoretical framework is that each situation provides some specific affordance, and these affordance allow the personality to emerge and to guide behavior. So, for example, among the affordance that we propose, we have the possibility of exploitation. So we would expect trust, like propensity to trust, to predict prosocial behavior in situations in which this possibility of exploitation is salient. So, for example, when you're playing a game first without knowing what other people are doing.
Right. But I mean, these individual differences, because you mentioned that there are people that cooperate across different contexts. I mean, it seems that they cooperate almost independently of the social context, right?
I mean, like people who are high on certain traits, like have like an enhanced propensity to be cooperative across a range of situations. It's not like never influenced by the situation, of course. But what we notice is, for example, we found that across studies, people who were categorized as prosocial according to the social value orientation. So those are people who really place a lot of value in the shared outcomes and the collective benefit. They were more those people cooperated significantly more in the games. So we have observed really the strongest correlations there. And some other traits that had like a very strong correlation with the prosocial behavior they observed were having like high levels of guilt proneness and high levels of honesty, humility, and in general some pro-environmentalist tendencies too.
The honesty, humility factor comes from the Execo, right?
Exactly, from the Exaco model. And these all relate to like being fair in a situation and yes, and to these affordance that I was of exploitation that I was mentioning before.
Right. Okay, so let me just ask you about one last topic. Since we're talking about cooperation in social psychology, we have the bystander effect. So does it vary depending on the levels of interpersonal trust we have in a particular society?
Oh, that's an interesting question. To be honest, I'm not aware of research that has compared the effect in a cross-cultural settings. In a cross-cultural setting, Mm, I would speculate that for so for the way the bystander effect has been theorized, we should not expect much of variation, because what is expected is a very strong effect of preventing individuals to display some helping behavior or prosocial behavior in situations where others are in place. And it doesn't seem to be related to cultural factors. It's all about the situation here. But I'm not sure about that, to be honest.
Yeah. But I mean, just one last question. This
Yeah.
bystander effect, it is still a thing, right? Because I'm asking you that because we had recently the replication crisis in psychology and more specifically in this case, social psychology. So is it supported by the evidence?
Yeah, I know what you mean, and indeed, besides the replication crisis in social psychology, very specific to the bystander effect was an increased criticism and increased, let's say, skepticism regarding the anecdote and the story of how the bystander effect also was made famous with. So like.
And by the way, could you tell us about that story? Because it's
Yeah, well,
interesting.
this is so basically the bystander effect was made very famous some years ago by John Darley and Bibla Tané when because of the murder of Kitty Genovese. So what happened is that like Kitty Genovese was killed, and what was really advertised in the newspaper is that during this murder, a lot of people were actually seeing that from the windows. Like I think there was maybe New York or a really metropolitan area. So when this went out in the news, there was a lot of blame toward those irresponsive bystanders, and this was a really powerful metaphor. But what happened very recently, and also there is a cool Netflix documentary for whoever is interested, is that they try to reconstruct that story and realize that this is there is like another side of the story, and maybe not entirely true or accurate what was displayed, because actually she received some help and some people called the police. So the stories are much weaker than what's presented. So this had some recent criticism. In terms of, from the scientific perspective, I think so. The most recent meta-analysis on the topic to get some cumulative evidence is still a bit outdated. So it's around 10 years ago or so. But in any case, even that meta-analysis did not find a strong evidence for like a publication bias. So it seems that the effect is robust with some ones. Like, for example, it works more in an experimental context rather than like in the field. But still, like we might expect it's fairly strong. We also provide with our in the past with our research group, also with the University of Palermo, a replication of this work, and we found some evidence.
But what is the explanation behind the bystander effect? Why do we have that effect on people?
So the most common explanation deals with the diffusion of responsibility. So if there is an emergency in place and we see that there are other people rather than us in the situation, we would be more likely to think somebody else is gonna take the responsibility and make that call and help. So the diffusion of responsibility was one of the main explanations that was put forward. But I think one important thing to mention here is that this kind of a prosocial behavior, it's the helping behavior in this situation is very special because it's particularly costly. So these situations, differently from what happens in social dilemma and in economic games, have a real cost, also like a physical cost to the person who is called to intervene in a situation. So it really becomes more tricky to explain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question. Do we know how to increase levels of interpersonal trust in society?
Wow, that's a very interesting last question. So, I mean, we can all think about interventions that revolve around designing institutions that work efficiently. And what we show, for example, with our work, is that in order for institutions to really shape and promote interpersonal trust, is very crucial that they are trusted themselves. So this is all about the perceptions of these institutions, and this is something that we can intervene, and especially institutions can do something about, because this perception is related to the idea that institutions are really competent and they're able to make the work they're asked for, and they're really benevolent, and they work in a way that is morally aligned with the citizens' standards. So we can work on this perception, and is really a kind of intervention that is not costly at all to make.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so just before we go, Giuliana, would you like to mention some of the best places on the internet where people can find your work?
You can find my work on my Google Scholar profile under Giuliana Spadaro, but you can also find the work I mentioned on the Cooperation Data Bank online, and some other work that I do together with the lab and the lab members is also in the Amsterdam Cooperation Lab webpage.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Juliana, again, thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you, Ricardo. It was a great pleasure for me.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've been doing this channel for 3 years now, and it is thanks to people like you who support the show that it's been running for so long. And so I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1 would already be a great help. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Logorero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Halleck, Jonathan V, Solanian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henry Kalenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, my producers, Izar Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Elian Gilligan, Sérgio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.